In Greek mythology, Helen of Troy, also known as Helen of Sparta, was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and was a sister of Castor, Pollux, and Clytemnestra. In Greek myths, she was considered the most beautiful woman in the world. By marriage she was Queen of Laconia, a province within Homeric Greece, the wife of King Menelaus. Her abduction by Paris, Prince of Troy, brought about the Trojan War. Elements of her putative biography come from classical authors such as Aristophanes, Cicero, Euripides and Homer. In her youth she was abducted by Theseus. A competition between her suitors for her hand in marriage sees Menelaus emerge victorious. An oath sworn beforehand by all the suitors requires them to provide military assistance in the case of her abduction. This oath culminates in the Trojan War. When she marries Menelaus, she is still very young. Whether her subsequent involvement with Paris is an abduction or a seduction is ambiguous. The legends recounting Helen's fate in Troy are contradictory. Homer depicts her as a wistful, even a sorrowful, figure, coming to regret her choice and wishing to be reunited with Menelaus. Other accounts have a treacherous Helen who simulates Bacchic rites and rejoices in the carnage. Ultimately, Paris was killed in action, and in Homer's account Helen was reunited with Menelaus, though other versions of the legend recount her ascending to Olympus instead. A cult associated with her developed in Hellenistic Laconia, both at Sparta and elsewhere. At Therapna she shared a shrine with Menelaus. She was also worshipped in Attica and on Rhodes. Her beauty inspired artists of all time to represent her, frequently as the personification of ideal beauty. Christopher Marlowe's lines from his tragedy Dr. Faustus are frequently cited. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships, and burnt the topmost towers of Ilium? Images of her start appearing in the 7th century BC. In classical Greece, her abduction by, or elopement with Paris was a popular motif. In medieval illustrations, this event was frequently portrayed as a seduction, whereas in Renaissance painting it is usually depicted as a rape by Paris. Etymology. The etymology of Helen's name continues to be a problem for scholars. Georg Curtius related Helen to the moon. Emil Boysak considered lambda epsilon nu eta to derive from the noun lambda epsilon nu eta meaning torch. It has also been suggested that the lambda of lambda epsilon nu eta arose from an original nous, and thus the etymology of the name is connected with the root of Venus. Linda Lee Clader, however, says that none of the above suggestions offers much satisfaction. None of the etymological sources appear to support the existence, save as a coincidence only, of a connection between the name of Helen and the name by which the classical Greeks commonly described themselves, namely Hellenic or Hellenistic, after Helen, the mythological progenitor of the Greeks. Prehistoric and mythological context. The origins of Helen's myth date back to the Mycenaean age. The first record of her name appears in the poems of Homer, but scholars assume that such myths invented or received by the Mycenaean Greeks made the way to Homer. Her mythological birthplace was Sparta of the Age of Heroes, which features prominently in the canon of Greek myth. In later ancient Greek memory, the Mycenaean Bronze Age became the age of the Greek heroes. The kings, queens, and heroes of the Trojan cycle are often related to the gods, since divine origins gave stature to the Greeks' heroic ancestors. The fall of Troy came to represent a fall from an illustrious heroic age, remembered for centuries in oral tradition before being written down. Recent archaeological excavations in Greece suggest that modern-day Laconia was a distinct territory in the Late Bronze Age. While the poets narrate that it was a rich kingdom, archaeologists have unsuccessfully looked for a Mycenaean palatial complex buried beneath present-day Sparta. Recent archaeological excavations at the Menelaus uncovered several findings, including 2 Mycenaean mansions. These mansions that were destroyed by an earthquake and by fire are considered by archaeologists to be the possible palace of Menelaus and Helen. Excavations made from the early 1990s to the present suggest that the area around Menelaus in the southern part of the Eurotas Valley seems to have been the center of Mycenaean Laconia. Life. Birth. In most sources, including the Iliad and the Odyssey, Helen is the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Euripides' play Helen, written in the late 5th century BC, is the earliest source to report the most familiar account of Helen's birth, that, although her putative father was Tindreas, she was actually Zeus' daughter. In the form of a swan, the king of gods was chased by an eagle, and sought refuge with Leda. The swan gained her affection, and the two mated. Leda then produced an egg, from which Helen emerged. The first Vatican mythographer introduces the notion that 2 eggs came from the union, one containing Castor and Pollux, one with Helen and Clytemnestra. Nevertheless, the same author earlier states that Helen, Castor and Pollux were produced from a single egg. Pseudo-Apollodorus states that Leda had intercourse with both Zeus and Tindreas the night she conceived Helen. On the other hand, in the Cypriot part of the epic cycle, Helen was the daughter of Zeus and the goddess Nemesis. The date of the Cypriot is uncertain, but it is generally thought to preserve traditions that date back to at least the 7th century BC. In the Cypriot, Nemesis did not wish to mate with Zeus. She therefore changed shape into various animals as she attempted to flee Zeus, finally becoming a goose. Zeus also transformed himself into a goose and mated with Nemesis, who produced an egg from which Helen was born. Presumably, in the Cypriot, this egg was somehow transferred to Leda. Later sources state either that it was brought to Leda by a shepherd who discovered it in a grove in Attica, or that it was dropped into her lap by Hermes. Asclepiades of Trajalos and Pseudo-Eratosthenes related a similar story, except that Zeus and Nemesis became swans instead of geese. Timothy Gantz has suggested that the tradition that Zeus came to Leda in the form of a swan derives from the version in which Zeus and Nemesis transformed into birds. Pausanias states that in the middle of the 2nd century AD, the remains of an eggshell, tied up in ribbons, were still suspended from the roof of a temple on the Spartan Acropolis. People believed that this was the famous egg that legend says Leda brought forth. Pausanias traveled to Sparta to visit the sanctuary dedicated to Hera and Phoebe, in order to see the relic for himself. Abduction by Theseus and youth. Two Athenians, Theseus and Peirithoos, thought that since they were both sons of gods, both of them should have divine wives. They thus pledged to help each other abduct 2 daughters of Zeus. Theseus chose Helen, and Peirithoos vowed to marry Persephone, the wife of Hades. Theseus took Helen and left her with his mother Aethra, his associate Aphidnus at Aphidnae or Athens. Theseus and Peirithoos then traveled to the underworld, the domain of Hades, to kidnap Persephone. Hades pretended to offer them hospitality and set a feast, but as soon as the pair sat down, snakes coiled around their feet and held them there. Helen's abduction caused an invasion of Athens by Castor and Pollux, who captured Aethra in revenge, and returned the sister to Sparta. In most accounts of this event, Helen was quite young. Helenocus of Lesbos said she was 7 years old, and Diodorus makes her 10 years old. On the other hand, Stesichorus said that Iphigenia was the daughter of Theseus and Helen, which obviously implies that Helen was of child childbearing age. In most sources, Iphigenia is the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, but Durus of Samos and other writers followed Stesichorus' account. Ovid's Heroides give us an idea of how ancient and, in particular, Roman authors imagined Helen in her youth. She is presented as a young princess wrestling naked in the Palaestra, an image alluding to a part of girls' physical education in classical Sparta. Sextus Propertius imagines Helen as a girl who practices arms and hunts with her brothers, or like Helen on the sands of Eurotas between Castor and Pollux, one to be victor in boxing, the other with horses. With naked breasts she carried weapons, they say, and did not blush with her divine brothers there. Suitors of Helen. When it was time for Helen to marry, many kings and princes from around the world came to seek her hand, bringing rich gifts with them, or sent emissaries to do so on their behalf. During the contest, Castor and Pollux had a prominent role in dealing with the suitors, although the final decision was in the hands of Tindreas. Menelaus, her future husband, did not attend but sent his brother Agamemnon to represent him. There are 3 available and not entirely consistent lists of suitors, compiled by Pseudo-Apollodorus, Hesiod, and Hyginus, for a total of 45 distinct names. There are only fragments from Hesiod's poem, so his list would have contained more. Achilles' absence from the lists is conspicuous, but Hesiod explains that he was too young to take part in the contest. Taken together, the list of suitors matches well with the captains in the catalogue of ships from the Iliad. However, some of the names may have been placed in the list of Helen's suitors simply because they went to Troy. It is not unlikely that relatives of a suitor may have joined the war. 6 suitors listed in all 3 sources. Ajax, son of Telamon, led 12 ships from Salamis to Troy, commits suicide there. Elephena, son of Chalcodon, led 50 ships to Troy and died there. Menelaus, son of Atreus, led 60 ships from Sparta to Troy. He returned home to Sparta with Helen. Menestheus, son of Peteus, led 50 ships from Athens to Troy. He returned to Athens after the war. Odysseus, son of Laertes, led 12 ships from Ithaca to Troy. He returned home after 10 years of wandering the seas. Protesilaus, son of Iphicles, led 40 ships from Philus to Troy. He was the first Greek to die in battle at the hands of Hector. 19 suitors listed by both Apollodorus and Hyginus. Agapenor, son of Ancaeus, king of Arcadia, takes 60 ships of men to Troy, returns home. Ajax, son of Oileus, led 40 ships to Troy, drowned on the way home when Poseidon split the rock he was on. Amphimachus, son of Stetis, with Polyxenus and Thalpius, he led 40 ships from Elis to Troy, killed by Hector. Antilochus, son of Nestor, went with his father and 90 ships to Troy, killed in battle while protecting his father from Memnon. Ascalaphus, son of Ares and king of Orchomenus, led 30 ships to Troy, killed in battle by Deiphobus. Diomedes, son of Tindreas. Diomedes was one of the Epigonian king of Argos. He led 80 ships to Troy. His wife took a lover and Diomedes lost his kingdom, so after the war he settled in Italy. Eumelus, son of Admetus and king of Pheræ, led 11 ships to Troy. Eurypylus, son of Euaemon, led 40 ships from Thessaly to Troy. Leontes, son of Coronos, with Polyputes he led 40 ships of the Lapiths to Troy. Machaon, son of Asclepius, brother of Podalirius, an Argonaut and physician, led 30 ships, killed in battle by Eurypylus. Meges, son of Phyleus, led 40 ships to Troy. Patroclus, son of Menetius, accompanied his younger cousin Achilles to Troy, where he was killed by Hector. Peneleos, son of Hippalsamus, an Argonaut, he went with the Boeotian force of 50 ships to Troy, killed in battle by Eurypylus. Philoctetes, son of Poes, led 7 ships from Thessaly to Troy. He was an archer and killed Paris. Podalirius, son of Asclepius, brother of Machaon, a physician. After the war he founded a city in Caria. Polypoetes, son of Piritaus, with Leontes he led 40 ships of the Lapiths to Troy. Pollux, son of Agasthenes, with Amphimachus and Thalpius he led 40 ships from Elis to Troy. Sthenelus, son of Capaneus, one of the Epigoni, he went with Diomedes to Troy. Thalpius, son of Eurythus, with Amphimachus and Pollux he led 40 ships from Elis to Troy. One suitor listed by Apollodorus and Hesiod, Amphilochus, son of Amphiaraus and younger brother of Alcmaeon. One suitor listed by Hesiod and Hyginus, Idomeneus, son of Deucalion and king of Crete, led 80 ships to Troy, survived the war, but was exiled from Crete. 3 suitors listed only by Hesiod: Alcmaeon, son of Amphiaraus and one of the Epigoni, Lycomedes, a Cretan, Podarces, the younger brother of Protesilaus. He led the troops after his brother's death. 10 suitors listed only by Hyginus: Ancaeus, son of King Lycurgus of Arcadia, Planiris, Clitius, Meriones, a companion of Idomeneus of Crete, Nereus, he led 3 ships from Syme to Troy. Phemius, Phidippus, he led 30 ships to Troy. Prothous, he led 40 ships from Magnetes to Troy. Thoas, he led 40 ships from Aetolia to Troy. Tlepolemus, he led 9 ships from Rhodes to Troy. 5 suitors listed only by Apollodorus: Epistrophes, son of Iphitus, brother of Schedius, Iolmenus, companion of Ascalaphus, who led 30 ships to Troy. Lytus, son of Elector, Schedius, son of Iphitus, brother of Epistrophes, he was killed by Hector, who was trying to throw a spear towards Ajax. Teucer, the half-brother of Ajax, survived the war. The oath of Tindreas. Tindreas was afraid to select a husband for his daughter, or send any of the suitors away, for fear of offending them and giving grounds for a quarrel. Odysseus was one of the suitors but had brought no gifts because he believed he had little chance to win the contest. He thus promised to solve the problem if Tindreas in turn would support him in his courting of Penelope, the daughter of Icarius. Tindreas readily agreed, and Odysseus proposed that, before the decision was made, all the suitors should swear a most solemn oath to defend the chosen husband against whoever should quarrel with him. After the suitors had sworn not to retaliate, Menelaus was chosen to be Helen's husband. As a sign of the importance of the pact, Tindreas sacrificed a horse. Helen and Menelaus became rulers of Sparta after Zeus and Leda abdicated. Menelaus and Helen rule in Sparta for at least 10 years. They have a daughter, Hermione, and 3 sons, Aethiolas, Mariphus, and Pleisthenes. The marriage of Helen and Menelaus marks the beginning of the end of the Age of Heroes. Concluding the catalogue of Helen's suitors, Hesiod reports Zeus planned to obliterate the race of men and the heroes in particular. The Trojan War, caused by Helen's elopement with Paris, is going to be his means to this end. Seduction by Paris. Paris, a Trojan prince, came to Sparta to claim Helen in the guise of a supposed diplomatic mission. Before this journey, Paris had been appointed by Zeus to judge the most beautiful goddess, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite. In order to earn his favor, Aphrodite promised Paris the most beautiful woman in the world. Swayed by Aphrodite's offer, Paris chose her as the most beautiful of the goddesses, earning the wrath of Athena and Hera. Although Helen is sometimes depicted as being raped by Paris, ancient Greek sources are often elliptical and contradictory. Herodotus states that Helen was abducted, but the Cypria simply mentions that, after giving Helen gifts, Aphrodite brings the Spartan queen together with the Prince of Troy. Sappho argues that Helen willingly left behind Menelaus and the 9-year-old daughter, Hermione, to be with Paris. Some say a host of horsemen, others of infantry and others of ships, is the most beautiful thing on the dark earth. But, I say, it is what you love full easy it is to make this understood of one and all, for she that far surpassed all mortals in beauty, Helen her most noble husband deserted, and went sailing to Troy, with never a thought for her daughter and dear parents. Dio Chrysostom gives a completely different account of the story, questioning Homer's credibility. After Agamemnon had married Helen's sister, Clytemnestra, Tindreas sought Helen's hand for Menelaus on account of political reasons. However, Helen was sought by many suitors who came from far and near, among them Paris, who surpassed all the others and won the favor of Tindreas and his sons. Thus he won her fairly and took her away to Troia, with the full consent of her natural protectors. Cyprian narrates that in just 3 days Paris and Helen reached Troy. Homer narrates that during a brief stopover in the small island of Cranae, according to Iliad, the two lovers consummated the passion. On the other hand, Cyprian notes that this happened the night before they left Sparta. Helen in Egypt. At least 3 ancient Greek authors denied that Helen ever went to Troy. Instead, they suggested Helen stayed in Egypt during the duration of the Trojan War. Those 3 authors are Euripides, Stesichorus, and Herodotus. In the version put forth by Euripides in his play Helen, Hera fashioned a likeness of Helen out of clouds at Zeus' request. Hermes took her to Egypt, and Helen never went to Troy, spending the entire war in Egypt. Eidolon is also present in Stesichorus' account, but not in Herodotus' rationalizing version of the myth. Herodotus adds weight to the Egyptian version of events by putting forward his own evidence. He traveled to Egypt and interviewed the priests of the temple at Memphis. According to these priests, Helen had arrived in Egypt shortly after leaving Sparta, because strong winds had blown Paris's ship off course. King Proteus of Egypt, appalled that Paris had seduced his host's wife and plundered his host's home in Sparta, disallowed Paris from taking Helen to Troy. Paris returned to Troy without a new bride, but the Greeks refused to believe that Helen was in Egypt and not within Troy's walls. Thus, Helen waited in Memphis for 10 years, while the Greeks and the Trojans fought. Following the conclusion of the Trojan War, Menelaus sailed to Memphis, where Proteus reunited him with Helen in Troy. When he discovered that his wife was missing, Menelaus called upon all the other suitors to fulfill their oaths, thus beginning the Trojan War. The Greek fleet gathered in Aulis, but the ships could not sail, because there was no wind. Artemis was enraged by a sacrilegious act of the Greeks, and only the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, could appease her. In Euripides' Iphigenia in Aulis, Clytemnestra, Iphigenia's mother and Helen's sister, begs her husband to reconsider his decision, calling Helen a wicked woman. Clytemnestra warns Agamemnon that sacrificing Iphigenia for Helen's sake is buying what we most detest with what we hold most dear. Before the opening of hostilities, the Greeks dispatched a delegation to the Trojans under Odysseus and Menelaus. They endeavored to persuade Priam to hand Helen back without success. A popular theme, the request of Helen, was the subject of a drama by Sophocles, now lost. Homer paints a poignant, lonely picture of Helen in Troy. She is filled with self-distaste and regret for what she has caused. By the end of the war, the Trojans have come to hate her. When Hector dies, she is the third mourner at his funeral, and she says that, of all the Trojans, Hector and Priam alone were always kind to her. Wherefore I wail alike for thee and for my hapless self with grief at heart. For no longer have I anyone beside in broad Troy that is gentle to me or kind, but all men shudder at me." These bitter words reveal that Helen gradually realized Paris's weaknesses, and she decided to ally herself with Hector. There is an affectionate relationship between the two of them, and Helen has harsh words to say for Paris when she compares the two brothers. "Howbeit, seeing the gods thus ordained these ills, would that I had been wife to a better man, that could feel the indignation of his fellows and the many revilings. But come now, enter in, and sit thee upon this chair, my brother, since above all others has trouble encompassed thy heart because of shameless me and the folly of Alexander." After Paris was killed in action, there was some dispute among the Trojans about which of Priam's surviving sons she should remarry, Helenus or Deiphobus, but she was given to the latter. Helen during the fall of Troy. During the fall of Troy, Helen's role is ambiguous. In Virgil's Aeneid, Deiphobus gives an account of Helen's treacherous stance. When the Trojan horse was admitted into the city, she feigned bacchic rites, leading a chorus of Trojan women, and, holding a torch among them, she signaled to the Greeks from the city's central tower. In Odyssey, however, Homer narrates a different story. Helen circled the horse 3 times, and she imitated the voices of the Greek women left behind at home. She thus tortured the men inside with the memory of the loved ones, and brought them to the brink of destruction. After the death of Hector and Paris, Helen became the paramour of the younger brother, Deiphobus, but when the sack of Troy began, she hid her new husband's sword, and left him to the mercy of Menelaus and Odysseus. In Aeneid, Aeneas meets the mutilated Deiphobus in Hades. His wounds serve as a testimony to his ignominious end, abetted by Helen's final act of treachery. However, Helen's portraits in Troy seem to contradict each other. From one side, we read about the treacherous Helen, who simulated bacchic rites and rejoiced over the carnage of Trojans. On the other hand, there is another Helen, lonely and helpless, desperate to find sanctuary, while Troy is on fire. Stesichorus narrates that both Greeks and Trojans gathered to stone her to death. When Menelaus finally found her, he raised his sword to kill her. He had demanded that only he should slay his unfaithful wife, but, when he was ready to do so, she dropped her robe from her shoulders, and the sight of her beauty caused him to let the sword drop from his hand. Electra wails, "Alas for my troubles! Can it be that her beauty has blunted the swords?" Fate. Helen returned to Sparta and lived for a time with Menelaus, where she was encountered by Telemachus in Book 4 of the Odyssey. According to another version, used by Euripides in his play Orestes, Helen had long ago left the mortal world by then, having been taken up to Mount Olympus almost immediately after Menelaus' return. A curious fate is recounted by Pausanias the geographer, which has Helen share the afterlife with Achilles. Pausanias the geographer has another story. The account of the Rhodians is different. They say that when Menelaus was dead, and Orestes still a wanderer, Helen was driven out by Nicostratus and Megapenthus and came to Rhodes, where she had a friend in Pollux, the wife of Tlepolemus. For Pollux, they say, was an Argive by descent, and when she was already married to Tlepolemus, shared his flight to Rhodes. At the time she was queen of the island, having been left with an orphan boy. They say that this Pollux desired to avenge the death of Tlepolemus on Helen, now that she had her in her power. So she sent against her when she was bathing handmaidens dressed up as Furies, who seized Helen and hanged her on a tree, and for this reason the Rhodians have a sanctuary of Helen of the Tree. Tlepolemus was a son of Heracles and Astyache. Astyache was a daughter of Phyleus, king of Ephyra, who was killed by Heracles. Tlepolemus was killed by Sarpedon on the first day of fighting in the Iliad. Nicostratus was a son of Menelaus by his concubine Pyrrhus, an Aetolian slave. Megapenthus was a son of Menelaus by his concubine Tindreas. No further origin. In the tragedy Trojan Women of Euripides, which takes place in Troy just after its fall, we learn that Helen will be taken back to Greece where a death sentence awaits her. In Simonianism, it was taught that Helen of Troy was one of the incarnations of the Anoia in human form.